The darkness inside the dome was almost complete. The emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting eerie, broken shadows across the metallic walls. Caleb clutched the small wrench he'd scavenged as a makeshift weapon. It was useless against the creatures, but the weight in his hand gave him a sliver of courage. Beside him, Lila's breathing was shallow, her eyes darting toward every faint sound. "We can't stay here," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but the resolve in her words was clear. Caleb nodded. The central dome was no longer safe. The creatures had breached the outer sections and were systematically dismantling the systems that kept the air breathable and the cold Martian night at bay. If they stayed, suffocation or freezing was inevitable. "We need to get to the atmospheric processing hub," Caleb said, his voice low. "If we can flood the dome with pure oxygen, it might ignite if we use the right spark." "That could kill us too," Lila replied, her eyes narrowing. "Better quick than what they'll do to us," Caleb said grimly, glancing toward the bulkhead where the creature's warped forms had begun to press against the reinforced steel. The door groaned under the strain, the metal warping unnaturally. Lila swallowed hard and nodded. "The main hub is 2 levels down. The maintenance corridors should still be clear. If we're fast, we can—" Her words were cut off by a sharp screech that echoed through the dome. Caleb froze. The sound was close, too close. He gestured for her to move, and they slipped into the corridor, keeping low. The air was thick with a strange organic smell, like rotting vegetation mixed with iron. The walls, once pristine, were now streaked with dark, viscous fluid. Tendrils sprouted from the corners, pulsating rhythmically as though the dome itself had become part of the infection. As they crept forward, a soft clicking sound grew louder. Caleb held up a hand, signaling Lila to stop. Ahead, one of the creatures lingered in the corridor, its grotesque body illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. It was once Mark. The thing's head swiveled unnaturally, its neck elongating as it sniffed the air. Its arms were now elongated, each finger tipped with a sharp, chitinous claw. Tendrils rippled along its spine, twisting and curling as though sensing vibrations. Caleb motioned for Lila to backtrack, but the sound of her boots scuffing against the floor was enough. The creature's head snapped toward them, and it let out an ear-splitting shriek. "Run!" Caleb shouted. They sprinted down the corridor, the creature's claws scraping against the walls as it pursued them. Caleb could hear more screeches joining the first, the sound multiplying as the hive responded. His lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, Lila's ragged breathing close behind him. They reached a junction and ducked into a side passage. Caleb yanked Lila into a maintenance alcove, pressing a hand over her mouth to stifle her gasps. The creature skittered past, its tendrils probing the air. It paused, sniffing, before continuing down the main corridor. Caleb lowered his hand, and they both exhaled shakily. "We can't keep outrunning them," Lila whispered. "We won't have to," Caleb replied, pulling a small tablet from his pocket. He tapped at the screen, bringing up the dome's systems map. "If we make it to the hub and flood the system, it should burn them out." "And us," Lila muttered, shaking her head. "One problem at a time," Caleb said. They navigated the maintenance corridors in silence, every sound amplified by the tension coiled in their bodies. Caleb's hands trembled as they reached the access hatch to the lower levels. The narrow ladder seemed endless as they climbed down, each creak of metal sending ripples of fear through him. When they reached the hub, Caleb immediately began working on the control panel. The room was cold, the air stale from the failing life support. The machinery hummed faintly, the last remnants of power struggling to keep the systems alive. Lila kept watch, gripping a broken metal pipe she'd found along the way. Her eyes darted toward every shadow, her knuckles white around the makeshift weapon. "Hurry up," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going as fast as I can," Caleb snapped, sweat dripping down his brow despite the freezing temperature. He bypassed the system's fail-safes, overriding the oxygen flow. A deep, guttural noise echoed through the corridors behind them. Lila stiffened, her grip tightening on the pipe. "They're coming." "Just a few more seconds," Caleb muttered. The sound grew louder, skittering, clicking, the wet slap of tendrils against metal. Caleb's hands moved frantically, his fingers dancing over the console. The creatures appeared in the doorway, their warped forms writhing and shifting in the dim light. Lila swung the pipe, striking one of them, but it barely flinched. Tendrils lashed out, slicing through the air. "I've got it!" Caleb shouted, slamming his hand on the final override. The oxygen flow surged, and Caleb grabbed Lila, pulling her toward the emergency hatch. "Go!" They climbed as the hub filled with the high-pitched shrieks of the creatures, their bodies reacting violently to the sudden influx of pure oxygen. Caleb reached for the emergency release on the hatch, a lighter clutched in his other hand. "Get clear!" he shouted to Lila. She hesitated, her eyes wide with realization. "Caleb, you can't—" "Go!" he roared. Lila climbed higher as Caleb flicked the lighter, dropping it into the hub. The last thing he saw before the fireball erupted was the swarm of creatures writhing in agony, their tendrils reaching for him even as they disintegrated in the inferno. The fire had gutted the hub, leaving behind a charred, smoldering ruin. Lila crawled out of the maintenance tunnel, coughing from the thick, acrid smoke. She pulled herself to her feet, her vision swimming, her body trembling with exhaustion and grief. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of distant flames. She looked back at the hatch, its edges warped and blackened. He was gone. Her legs buckled and she sank to the floor, her chest heaving as sobs racked her body. For a moment she allowed herself to grieve, to feel the weight of loss pressing down on her. But the sound of faint clicking in the distance reminded her that grief could wait. The creatures weren't all gone. The fire had purged the central hub, but the infection had spread too far. The dome groaned ominously as the structural integrity failed, the creature's corrosion having weakened it from within. The air grew colder, thinner, as the life support systems continued to fail. Lila forced herself to stand, leaning against the wall for support. She wiped her tears with a shaking hand and looked at the tablet strapped to her wrist. It displayed a grim reality. Oxygen reserves critically low, power reserves drained. The atmosphere would become unbreathable within hours. Her only chance was the emergency escape pod located in Habitat 2. But to get there, she'd have to navigate through the heart of the dome, where the surviving creatures still roamed. Gripping the broken pipe like a lifeline, Lila stumbled forward. Every step was agony. Her muscles ached, her throat burned, and her head pounded with dehydration. The corridors were eerily quiet, the only sound her ragged breathing and the faint hiss of leaking oxygen. She reached a junction and paused, her ears straining. A faint clicking sound echoed from one of the corridors. Lila froze, holding her breath. A shadow flickered in the dim light, moving unnaturally fast. The creature emerged, a grotesque fusion of human and alien biology. Its skin glistened with a mucus-like sheen, and its tendrils twitched as it sniffed the air. It hadn't seen her yet. Lila gripped the pipe tightly, her palms slick with sweat. She stepped backward, her foot catching on a loose cable. The noise was slight, but it was enough. The creature's head snapped toward her, its black, soulless eyes locking onto hers. It let out a guttural screech, and Lila bolted. Her heart thundered in her chest as she sprinted through the maze of corridors. The creature gave chase, its claws scraping against the walls, its tendrils lashing out. Lila didn't dare look back. The escape pod hatch came into view, illuminated by a single flickering light. She reached it and slammed her hand against the access panel, praying the system still had power. The door groaned open, slower than she'd hoped. The creature lunged, its tendrils narrowly missing her as she threw herself into the pod. She slammed the panel inside, and the door sealed shut. The creature pounded against the thick metal, its screeches muffled but still terrifyingly loud. Lila collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. The pod was small, barely enough room to stand. A single console displayed the planet's surface and the void of space beyond. She activated the launch sequence, her fingers trembling. The countdown began, and she felt the pod shake as the docking clamps released. The pod's engines roared to life, and for the first time in days, she felt hope. She was escaping. She was leaving Mars behind. As the pod ascended, she looked out of the small viewport. Below the dome was a blackened husk, its lights flickering sporadically. But then her eyes widened. The infection wasn't contained. The creatures had begun to spread beyond the dome, their tendrils digging into the Martian soil. Patches of dark, pulsating growth extended like veins across the barren landscape. Her hope faltered. The creatures were adapting to Mars itself, thriving in the harsh conditions. They didn't need the dome or the humans anymore. The pod systems chirped, pulling her attention back to the console. A blinking red warning appeared on the screen. Contamination detected. Her blood ran cold. She glanced at her arm, where a faint black vein had begun to spread from a small cut she hadn't noticed before. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. She gripped her arm as if she could will the infection to stop. But it was too late. The tendrils beneath her skin were already moving. She slumped back in the seat, tears streaming down her face. The pod hurtled toward orbit, carrying her and the infection off the surface of Mars. As the planet shrank in the viewport, Lila recorded a final message, her voice thick with despair. "To anyone who finds this, don't come to Mars. Don't send rescue missions. Burn it. Destroy it. It's not a place for us. It never was." The transmission ended. Lila closed her eyes, feeling the alien presence inside her growing stronger. The pod drifted into the void, a lonely harbinger of humanity's hubris and its inevitable doom. Mars had won, and soon the infection would spread beyond it.